20 doctors. All of them failed. A billionaire lay dying in a hospital suite worth more than most houses in Boston.
We've done everything.
Machines screamed. Specialists argued. Hope slipped away. And then, the truth was uncovered by the one person nobody noticed. Not a surgeon. Not a Harvard genius. A black janitor on the night shift, pushing a mop across the floor while the brightest minds in medicine searched for answers. She smelled something metallic in the air. She saw his fingernails turning yellow. She remembered the pattern from a chemistry class she had to abandon years ago. And in that instant, she knew. She knew exactly what was killing him. Here's the shock. 20 of America's finest doctors missed the poison. The invisible woman cleaning their floors didn't. So let me ask you, if your life hung by a thread, who would you trust? The 20 specialists with walls of diplomas? Or the custodian who saw what no one else could? This is not just a story about medicine, it's a story about power, about who gets ignored, and who finally gets heard. You're watching Black Voice Matter, where hidden voices, overlooked lives, and untold truths take the spotlight. Stay with us, because what happens next will change the way you see invisible forever. Boston. Winter snow blankets the city outside, but inside Massachusetts General Hospital's luxury wing, the air is warm, polished, and expensive. The suite looks less like a place to fight for life and more like a five-star hotel. Walnut-paneled walls, soft amber lights, modern art hanging silently over machines that beep behind hidden panels. On that bed lies Ethan Caldwell, once the face of America's tech boom, now reduced to shallow breaths and fading color. His empire built on algorithms, and code can't protect him here. Every hour his pulse weakens. Every treatment tried by his doctors only pushes him closer to the edge. Around him, 24 of the sharpest medical minds America can offer. Specialists from Harvard, researchers from Johns Hopkins, veterans from the Mayo Clinic. Their voices overlap in rapid-fire jargon, autoimmune, neurology, rare genetic conditions. They are brilliant, yet powerless. Every chart they review raises more questions. Every theory collapses under new test results. And in the middle of this storm, unseen, is Monica Harris, 38 years old. Night shift custodian. Her grey uniform blends into the walls. Her footsteps barely register over the machines. To the doctors, she is furniture, a shadow, nothing more. But Monica notices things others don't. The air in the room carries a metallic tang. The billionaire's fingernails carry a sickly yellow. His hair falls in uneven patches onto the crisp white pillow. To the doctors, these are scattered symptoms that don't add up. To Monica, they form a pattern. A memory long buried stirs. The toxicology lecture she once sat through at NYU before family tragedy forced her to quit. And suddenly, she sees it clearly. Not a mystery disease, not a failing immune system, but a poison. She holds the truth in her mind like glass, sharp and fragile. But the question remains, who would listen to a janitor in a faded uniform when 20 doctors with endless credentials couldn't see it? That is where our story begins. A story not only about science and survival, but about who gets the right to be heard in a world that chooses who matters and who disappears into the background. Boston's skyline shimmered in the distance, but inside the private wing of Massachusetts General, time felt frozen. The suite was built to soothe fear with luxury. Walnut walls, gold fixtures, a chandelier that belonged in a Manhattan penthouse, not a hospital. If you squinted, you could mistake it for a presidential suite at the Four Seasons. But no chandelier could silence the sound of failing life. Ethan Caldwell lay in the center of it all, 55 years old. The architect of a tech empire worth $7 billion. Once his voice could move markets. Now his lips trembled with each breath, his chest rising shallow, skin painted in a grayish yellow no designer suit could ever disguise. Around him, white coats crowded like storm clouds. 20 doctors, names that carried weight in every medical journal. Dr. Jonathan Myers from Harvard, his silver hair combed as precisely as his theories. Dr. Susan Blake of Mayo Clinic, sharp eyes darting over lab reports like a hawk. They spoke in hushed tones, but their words filled the room. Neuropathy advancing. Liver enzymes crashing. Test results don't align. They were brilliant, they were desperate, and they were losing. In the corner, unnoticed, Monica Harris moved quietly with her mop. 38 years old, a single mother from Baltimore, once a scholarship student at NYU chemistry major. But life had other plans. Her mother's sudden death, 2 younger siblings to raise, rent overdue, tuition abandoned. Now, instead of lab coats and experiments, she wore a janitor's uniform and pushed a cart of bleach and rags. To the doctors, she was invisible. To Ethan Caldwell's family, she was background noise. Even the nurses barely registered her presence. But Monica's mind never stopped observing. It was her silent rebellion, refusing to let knowledge die, even when her career had been stolen. As she wiped down the mahogany nightstand, her senses flared. A faint trace in the air, metallic, sharp, almost bitter. It clung to the back of her throat, a taste no air freshener could mask. Her eyes drifted to Caldwell's hands, fingernails tinged yellow. Her gaze rose to the pillow. Strands of hair scattered like fallen feathers, uneven, brittle. Her pulse quickened. 15 years ago, she sat in a lecture hall at NYU, Professor Harrison's voice echoing, "Toxins don't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they whisper. Through nails, through hair, through nerves. The patterns are subtle, until it's too late." Those words slammed into her memory. She looked back at Ethan Caldwell's body. The puzzle pieces aligned. Not autoimmune, not infection. Something darker, something deliberate. Her chest tightened. She gripped the mop handle like it could ground her spinning thoughts. She wanted to scream, "It's poisoning! Can't you see?" But her voice caught in her throat, because she knew the truth. No one would listen. In this $1 million room, her uniform carried no weight. She could mop the floor, but she couldn't speak into the air thick with degrees and prestige. Monica turned away, hiding her racing heart. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the polished cabinet glass. Tired eyes, calloused hands. The face of a woman who once dreamed of being on the other side of the conversation. She whispered under her breath, almost a prayer, "They don't see me, but I see everything." The doctors argued over charts inches from her. One gestured angrily at the numbers. Another rubbed his temples, muttering about rare syndromes. Monica wanted to step forward, slam her hands on the table and shout the answer. But fear was a cage built from years of dismissal, from every moment someone waved her away with, "Stick to cleaning, Monica." She swallowed her words. Instead, she kept working. Her hands moved, but her mind raced. The metallic air, the nails, the hair, the failing nerves. It all screamed one word inside her head. But inside this suite, her silence was louder than truth. The clock ticked past midnight. Outside, the snow fell gently. Inside, a billionaire's empire teetered on the edge of collapse, because knowledge existed in the mind of someone no one would believe. And Monica Harris stood in the shadows, holding the truth like a burning secret. A secret that could save Ethan Caldwell. Or destroy her. What happens when the past you buried refuses to stay silent? For Monica Harris, the signs in Ethan Caldwell's body weren't just symptoms. They were ghosts of the education she was forced to abandon, and those ghosts were about to demand she listen. The smell of antiseptic faded from Monica's nose, but the memory it awakened came rushing back. New York City, 15 years earlier. A younger Monica Harris sat in a crowded lecture hall at NYU, a notebook filled with chemical equations, each line written with precise, almost artistic care. Other students doodled, some scrolled their phones. But Monica, she was alive in these lectures. Professor Harrison's voice thundered across the room. Chemistry isn't just formulas, it's the language of life itself. If you learn to read the signs, you can see what others miss. Those words had lit a fire in her. For Monica, chemistry wasn't theory. It was a lens to decode the world. Why leaves changed color in fall, why metal rusted, why a simple toxin could bring down a powerful body. Back then, she wasn't invisible. She was brilliant, top of her class. Her lab partner once whispered, "You're the kind of mind that changes textbooks." And she believed it. For a while. Then the phone call came. Her mother, gone in a car accident. 2 younger siblings left behind in Baltimore. Rent overdue. Bills piling up. The scholarship covered tuition, but not food, not diapers, not electricity. Monica packed her textbooks into a box and took the bus home. She promised her professors she'd be back next semester. She never returned. Baltimore didn't welcome her back as a scholar. It swallowed her as a survivor. She worked 2 jobs, waitressing by day, cleaning offices by night. Her siblings needed clothes, meals, someone to help with homework. And when they slept, she stayed up reading. Old chemistry journals borrowed from the library. YouTube lectures played on a flickering second-hand laptop. Knowledge was still hers. But dreams don't pay rent. One by one, classmates she once outshined went on to PhDs, labs, conferences in Europe. Their photos filled LinkedIn feeds. Monica scrolled in silence, uniform smelling of bleach, her hands cracked from cleaning chemicals. That's the hidden price of the so-called American dream. For many black families, brilliance is never enough. One tragedy, one paycheck missed, and the dream collapses under the weight of survival. Sociologists call it the opportunity gap. Monica just called it life. Yet deep inside, the fire never died. Every time she saw a chemical label on a cleaning product, her brain dissected it. Sodium hypochlorite, ammonium compounds. Every smell carried a memory of the lab. She couldn't stop analyzing. Once, while mixing basic cleaners at her janitorial job, she muttered out loud, "This reaction is exothermic. Don't combine these." A co-worker laughed. "Girl, you sound like a scientist." Monica smiled faintly. She used to be one. Back in the hospital room, watching Ethan Caldwell fade, Monica felt the sting of all those lost years. The signs on his body weren't just medical puzzles, they were ghosts of her abandoned education. She thought of her siblings, her little brother Marcus, now working at a car garage, her sister Tasha, juggling 2 kids of her own. They survived because Monica sacrificed her future. But tonight, as she watched a billionaire die, a thought echoed bitterly. I gave up my dream, but maybe my dream is the only thing that can save him. The irony cut deep. 20 doctors, trained and celebrated, circling around like satellites. And the one person holding the answer was the janitor who never got her degree. Monica's heart pounded. The past she buried refused to stay quiet. She remembered a quote she once highlighted in a toxicology textbook. The difference between life and death is often who notices first. 15 years ago, she wanted to be that person, the one who noticed. Now fate was cornering her, demanding she choose, stay silent in her uniform, or risk everything by speaking. Outside, the snowstorm grew heavier. Inside, so did Monica's storm of memory and fear. She glanced once more at Ethan Caldwell. His empire worth billions, her life worth pennies. And yet, in this room, the equation was flipped. He had the wealth, she had the knowledge, and she was the only one who could solve the problem. Monica Harris knew the signs, she knew the answer, but knowledge without voice is a prison. And in a room ruled by titles and prestige, what chance does an invisible woman have to be heard? The room buzzed with authority. Dr. Jonathan Myers adjusted his glasses, his silver hair gleaming under the chandelier light. Harvard's pride. A man whose lectures were streamed worldwide, whose research grants could fund small countries. Beside him, Dr. Susan Blake flipped through a stack of reports. Mayo Clinic's rising star. Her tone clipped, sharp as glass. Every sentence she spoke landed like a verdict. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices weaving a web of prestige. "Autoimmune cascade," Myers said firmly. "Neurological degeneration," Blake countered. "Unlikely." Myers shook his head. "Then explain the nerve deterioration." She snapped back. Charts flew across the table. Acronyms filled the air. ANA, MRI, EEG. Their conversation was a storm of brilliance, blinding in its intensity. And yet, in that storm, the patient's life ebbed away. Monica Harris pushed her cart closer to the wall, pretending to dust. She moved slow, silent, her ears wide open. Each phrase from the doctors felt like déjà vu. She'd heard it before, in lectures, in labs, in the textbooks she devoured late at night by lamplight. But she also heard something else. A flaw, a blind spot. They were circling the wrong answers, chasing ghosts in the data, splitting symptoms into isolated puzzles when to her they spelled a single word. Poison. Her hands tightened on the rag she was wringing. Her knuckles turned white. She wanted to shout, "You're missing it! Look at the nails! Look at the hair! Connect the dots!" But she stayed silent, because in this room her uniform was louder than her knowledge. Dr. Myers gestured toward Monica without even turning. "Can we clear the staff out? We need privacy." Not even her name, just staff. Monica dipped her head, hiding the sting. She had learned this posture over years, chin down, lips closed, emotions locked inside. Invisible. Again. That's the weight of credentialism in America. A Harvard badge can silence a janitor's truth, no matter how sharp. A Mayo Clinic title can dismiss lived experience with a flick of the wrist. Sociologists call it status bias. Studies prove it. When the same idea is voiced by someone with a PhD, it's applauded. From a janitor, ignored. Monica knew it well. She lived it every shift. The doctor's debate grew louder. Liver function's collapsing, but tox screens are clean. It's autoimmune. We need aggressive steroids. No, steroids will worsen his neuropathy. Their voices clashed like swords. None of them noticed Monica pausing by the bed, her eyes fixed on the billionaire's brittle hair scattered across the pillow. None of them saw the quiet realization blooming in her chest. She thought of her younger self, sitting in Professor Harrison's class at NYU. He once told her, "Science isn't always about finding new answers. Sometimes it's about noticing the obvious, what everyone else overlooks because they think it's too simple." Now, in this suite filled with medical royalty, the obvious was being buried under prestige. Yellow nails, hair loss, metallic taste in the air. A chain of clues anyone could see, if they bothered to look beyond their own brilliance. Monica's throat tightened. She whispered to herself, almost inaudible, "They don't see me, but I see everything." The irony was suffocating. These doctors were thousands per hour, drowning in acronyms and theories, and the janitor earning $14 an hour holding the key. The contrast stung. It was America in a single room. Dr. Blake's voice cut the air. "We need to rule out paraneoplastic syndromes. Order another panel." Dr. Myers sighed. "We've tested everything. The pattern makes no sense." Monica's chest burned. The pattern makes perfect sense. But she said nothing, because in this room her silence wasn't a choice. It was survival. She thought of every time in Baltimore she'd been told, "Don't get ahead of yourself." Every time she corrected a customer about a cleaning chemical and they laughed. Every time her own knowledge was met with smirks. Being smart was never enough, not without credentials. That's credentialism's cruelest trick. It convinces the world that wisdom only counts if it comes with letters after your name. The meeting broke for a moment. Doctors stepped aside, murmuring into phones. Nurses shuffled in with medications. The hum of the machines filled the silence. Monica lingered near the nightstand. Her eyes locked again on the small jar of imported hand cream. The label glistened under the soft light. She remembered how its position had shifted slightly since yesterday. The cream, the smell, the symptoms. Her mind screamed the truth. She wanted to lift the jar and thrust it in front of Myers. "Test this! Test this, damn it!" But her hand stayed at her sides, because she knew what would happen. They'd laugh, they'd warn her, maybe even fire her. And then what? Her kids without food? Her rent unpaid? Truth was expensive, and she couldn't afford it. Still, her eyes kept returning to that jar, the trap disguised as comfort. And she wondered how many lives had been lost, not because answers didn't exist, but because the wrong voices were silenced. Monica inhaled slowly. The metallic taste lingered. The ghosts of her NYU lectures whispered louder. Knowledge pressed against the bars of her silence, desperate to break free. But in this moment, she remained the shadow, the one who knew, the one unseen. But shadows can't stay silent forever, and in the glimmer of a luxury hand cream jar, Monica Harris would soon find the courage to risk everything. The door opened, and with it came a man dressed in tailored grey wool, cufflinks glinting, cologne sharp and expensive. Charles Whitmore, old friend, former rival. Now, suddenly, the ever-present visitor. "Jonathan, Susan." His voice smooth as velvet. "Any progress?" Dr. Myers shook his head, weary. Dr. Blake folded her arms. "We're trying." Charles stepped closer to the bed, eyes soft with counterfeit sorrow. He placed something on the nightstand with deliberate grace. A small jar. Black. Elegant. Imported. "His favorite hand cream," Charles said. "From Switzerland. The only brand he'll tolerate. Comfort matters, even now." Monica froze. Her eyes locked onto the jar. She'd seen it yesterday, in a slightly different spot. And now, moved again. Always prominent, always within reach. Her instincts prickled. She leaned closer while wiping the table. The lid caught the chandelier's light. For a split second, a metallic sheen shimmered across the surface. Not normal, not harmless. Her chest tightened. Charles smiled faintly as the nurse began applying the cream to Ethan's hands. "See?" he said warmly. "Even unconscious, he finds comfort in it." But Monica's stomach churned. Comfort or poison? The pieces screamed at her. The air's metallic tang, the nails, the hair loss, the neuropathy. And now, this jar. This gift Charles insisted on delivering himself. She remembered an article she once read on her battered laptop. FDA warns of heavy metals in imported cosmetics. A report about skin creams from overseas loaded with mercury, arsenic, even lead. The victims were mostly women of color, unknowingly poisoning themselves for beauty. The phrase haunted her. Applied daily, absorbed slowly, damage irreversible. She whispered to herself, barely audible. That's exactly what's happening here. Dr. Blake barely glanced at the cream. Luxury to her was background noise, but Monica saw it for what it was. Not a moisturizer. A weapon. Charles placed a hand on Ethan's arm, sighing theatrically. He was always so particular about this brand, wouldn't use anything else. Strange, isn't it? Strange indeed. Too particular. Too insistent. Monica's mind churned. Why was the jar always shifted? Why did Charles himself always bring it? Why did he watch so closely as nurses applied it? It was too neat, too deliberate. Her pulse raced. He's poisoning him, right in front of them. And they can't see it. She thought of another case she once read about. California, 2013. A woman hospitalized for seizures. Doctors searched for tumors, infections, autoimmune flare-ups. The real culprit. A face cream from Mexico laced with mercury. By the time they found it, her brain was already scarred. The report's conclusion was blunt. Sometimes the deadliest toxins come in the prettiest jars. Now, in this Boston suite, history was repeating. And the only person who recognized it was the janitor no one acknowledged. Monica gripped her rag until her fingers ached. Every instinct screamed at her to speak, to grab the jar, throw it in Myers's face and yell, "Test this! Test it now!" But fear pinned her down. She imagined security escorting her out, her badge revoked, her kids waiting at home, hungry. Truth was heavy. And the system had taught her, only certain people are allowed to carry it. Charles adjusted his cufflinks, eyes cold for a flicker of a second. When he turned toward Monica, she quickly dropped her gaze. He didn't notice her watching. Or maybe he thought she didn't matter. That was his mistake. Hours later, when the room emptied, Monica lingered. She inched toward the jar. The lid still shone faintly under the light. Her fingers itched to open it, to scoop a sample, to prove what her gut already knew. She didn't dare, not yet. But her resolve hardened. If the doctors wouldn't see, she would make them. If they wouldn't test, she would find a way. Because buried inside that elegant jar was the truth, and she was the only one who could set it free. That night, Monica Harris made a choice. She would stop being invisible. With nothing but cleaning supplies and her old chemistry notes, she would risk everything to test the poison herself. The luxury suite grew quiet after midnight. Doctors gone, nurses switching shifts, machines humming steady. Monica lingered in the shadows, her eyes fixed on the black jar of hand cream. The elegant container glowed faintly under the amber lights, like a secret daring her to touch it. Her hands trembled. One mistake, and she could lose her job. But the thought pressed harder. One mistake in silence, and Ethan Caldwell would lose his life. She glanced around. Empty hallway. No footsteps. With practiced speed, she pulled a sterile specimen cup from her cart, swiped earlier from supply. She twisted the lid, scooped a small dab of cream, slipped it into her pocket, closed the jar carefully, placing it back in the exact position Charles Whitmore had left it. Her heart hammered like a drum. Every second felt stolen. Later, in a cramped janitorial closet, Monica locked the door. She laid out her stolen treasure on a stack of cleaning rags. From her cart, she pulled what looked like ordinary supplies. Baking soda, aluminum foil, vinegar, a cheap spray bottle. To anyone else, it was janitor's junk. To Monica, it was a lab. Her mind flickered back 15 years. NYU's chemistry lab, white coats, beakers lined in rows. Professor Harrison's voice, "Science doesn't care about your title. It cares about observation, method, proof. Even in the smallest setup, truth reveals itself." She remembered the pride she felt running titrations, watching colors shift like secrets unfolding. Back then, she belonged. Here she was trespassing into her own past. She lined the foil into a makeshift dish, added the cream, sprinkled baking soda, drops of vinegar. She waited. Breath held. A faint shimmer bloomed. Not normal. A subtle reaction she recognized, heavy metals binding, shifting the color just enough to betray their presence. Her pulse spiked. Thallium. She wasn't guessing anymore. She had proof. A wave of triumph surged, immediately followed by fear. How could she present this? Would anyone listen? The door rattled. "Monica?" A voice. Sharp. "Hospital security." She panicked, sweeping the makeshift setup into her cart. Yes?" The guard opened the door, his expression stern. "We've had reports. You've been interfering with medical matters. Stay in your lane, or you'll be written up." Monica forced her face neutral. "Yes, sir, just cleaning." The door shut. Her knees weakened. She nearly collapsed onto the stool. One wrong step, and she'd lose everything. But inside her pocket, the sample sat. The truth was still hers. Her mind raced. She thought of her siblings, the years of sacrifice. She thought of Ethan Caldwell's shallow breaths, and she thought of Charles Whitmore's cold smile. Fear and resolve collided inside her chest. She whispered, steadying herself. "I didn't fight my way through all these years, just to stay invisible now." Images flashed of past cases she'd read. A young girl poisoned in Minnesota by lead-tainted lipstick. An entire family sickened by imported skin-lightening cream in California. The reports always read the same. Symptoms misdiagnosed. Time lost. Damage permanent. Each story ended with a footnote of tragedy. Monica refused to let Ethan Caldwell become another footnote. She pulled her phone from her pocket, snapped photos of the reaction, the shimmer, the discoloration. Evidence. Primitive, but undeniable to anyone who cared to look. She whispered again, almost like a vow, "You will see me. You will see this." When her shift ended, Monica walked out into the icy Boston night. Snow fell heavy, muffling the streets. Her body was exhausted, but her mind blazed. She clutched her coat tighter. Inside her bag lay the photos, the notes she scribbled, the tiny container of cream. Her secret weapon. She was no longer just a janitor cleaning floors. She was a scientist in exile, fighting her way back. Armed with fragile proof, Monica Harris prepared to confront the storm. 20 doctors had dismissed her before, but soon she would step into their world and force them to face the truth she carried. Morning sunlight cut through the frosted windows of Massachusetts General. Inside the conference room, tension thickened the air. 20 specialists gathered around a mahogany table, charts stacked high, screens flickering with lab results. Dr. Jonathan Myers stood at the head, silver hair immaculate, voice commanding. "We've exhausted conventional pathways," he announced. "Caldwell's decline is accelerating. If we cannot stabilize within the next 48 hours... The room fell silent. Everyone knew what that meant. And then the door opened. Every head turned. Monica Harris stepped in. Grey uniform, cleaning badge. A folder clutched in her hands, trembling but steady enough. Her voice cut the silence. "You're looking in the wrong place. Ethan Caldwell isn't dying of disease. He's being poisoned." Laughter. Not cruel at first, just incredulous. A ripple through the room. Dr. Myers's brows furrowed. "This is a closed medical conference. Please leave." Monica's knees shook, but she didn't move. She set the folder on the table. Photos, notes, a tiny container of cream. Her voice steadied. "Thallium, absorbed through skin, carried in the hand cream Charles Whitmore brings every visit." Dr. Blake raised an eyebrow. "Thallium? That's preposterous. We ran heavy metal panels already." Monica leaned forward, her eyes fierce. "Yes, panels detect acute exposure, but not microdoses applied daily. Levels stayed just below thresholds until the body collapses." She flipped a page. Ethan's lab timeline. Neuropathy creeping upward, hair loss accelerating, digestive decline. "Look at the progression." She pressed. "Every spike matches Whitmore's visits. Every symptom lines up with textbook thallium poisoning." Dr. Myers smirked. "A custodian diagnosing thallium? Do you know how absurd that sounds?" Monica met his gaze. "I do, but absurd doesn't make it wrong." The room stilled. Her voice deepened, controlled. "I studied chemistry at NYU. I never finished. Life didn't let me. But I never stopped learning. And what I see on Caldwell's body, it's exactly what Professor Harrison once called the perfect poison. Colorless, odorless, invisible, unless you know what to look for." She slid the photos across the table, a faint metallic shimmer in her improvised test. Hair strands brittle against the pillow, yellowed nails under fluorescent light. 20 doctors saw fragments," she said softly. "I saw the pattern." Dr. Blake opened the folder, eyes narrowing. The evidence unsettled her. Another doctor muttered, "The neuropathy is ascending. It matches." Dr. Myers slammed the table. "Coincidence. Correlation is not causation." Monica's heart pounded. This was the moment. She lifted the cream jar, holding it up to the light. Every dose delivered through this, each application small enough to escape suspicion. Thallium binds in tissue, accumulates in hair, nails, nerves, exactly what's killing him. Her hand shook, but her voice did not. "If you test specifically for thallium, blood, hair, this cream, you'll see it, and you'll realize you've been treating the wrong thing all along." The room hushed. Dr. Myers opened his mouth to retort, but Dr. Susan Blake cut in. "Wait." She scanned the timeline Monica laid out. Her voice softened. "The intervals do match." Another specialist leaned forward. "And the hair pattern. It's classic." Murmurs spread. One by one, disbelief gave way to recognition. The janitor's words carried weight. Monica felt her throat tighten. For years, she'd been invisible, dismissed, ignored. Now 20 of America's brightest minds were listening. She whispered, barely audible, "Sometimes the truth doesn't wear a white coat." Dr. Myers's face hardened, but even he couldn't ignore the shifting tide. Finally, through clenched teeth, "Run a focused toxicology panel for thallium, immediately." The order left his lips, reluctant but undeniable. Monica stepped back, her body trembling. Not from fear this time, but from the weight of being seen. The silence in that room was different now. Not dismissal, not laughter, but the heavy stillness of realization. They had missed it. She had not. The tests were ordered. The clock was ticking. And as the results closed in, so did the truth, that Ethan Caldwell's life depended on whether Monica Harris's gamble was right. The conference room door slammed open. 2 nurses rushed in, breathless, clutching fresh lab reports. Dr. Blake grabbed the papers, scanning line by line. Her face paled. "Elevated thallium levels," she whispered, confirmed. "Blood, urine, and hair samples." A stunned silence blanketed the room. Every eye turned toward Monica Harris, the janitor, the woman in the grey uniform, the one they dismissed. She had been right. Chaos erupted. Orders flew like gunfire. Get toxicology on standby. Prepare chelation therapy. No, wait. Prussian blue first. Move. We don't have minutes to waste. Doctors who had ignored Monica now scrambled in coordinated panic. Nurses wheeled in carts. Vials clinked. Machines beeped faster. And in the middle of it all, Ethan Caldwell's fragile body became the battlefield. Monica pressed against the wall, her hands trembling. She wasn't trained for this part. She wasn't here to lead the charge. But as she watched, she realized. She had already done the hardest thing. She had forced them to see. Dr. Myers barked, "Administer Prussian blue immediately!" The antidote, the one substance known to bind thallium, dragging the poison out, molecule by molecule. A syringe pierced Caldwell's IV line. The cobalt blue solution coursed into his veins. For hours, the room held its breath. Monitors flickered. Vitals danced between collapse and recovery. Each beep was torture. Monica prayed silently. Her eyes burned, locked on the man she had risked everything to save. Then, a sound. Steady. Stronger. Caldwell's heart rate rising, stabilizing. A nurse exhaled in disbelief. "He's responding." The room erupted again. This time, not with panic, but with relief. In the corner, Charles Whitmore's face darkened, his hands clenched, jaw tight. The mask of sympathy he wore so well cracked at the edges. Monica noticed. The doctors were too busy celebrating their miracle. But she saw Charles watching the monitors with something colder than concern. She remembered his words. His favorite hand cream. Only this brand comforts him. Now the truth was screaming from every chart. That jar had been his weapon. Security entered quietly. 2 plainclothes agents followed, flashing badges. Hospital administration had already escalated. They approached Charles. "Sir, we need you to come with us for some questions." He scoffed. "Ridiculous. I'm his closest friend who always brought the cream." Monica whispered. Her words cut through the room. Everyone froze. Charles turned, eyes burning into her. The janitor, the one he never thought mattered. Now she was the one dismantling his empire of lies. The FBI agent stepped forward. One produced a tablet showing surveillance stills. Charles, alone in Caldwell's suite, twisting open the jar, applying the cream himself. Evidence undeniable. Charles's confidence collapsed. He tried to protest, but his voice cracked. The agents cuffed him, reading rights, motives already circulating, corporate espionage, control of Caldwell's company before its massive IPO, a billion-dollar betrayal. Monica's chest ached. She thought of every night she scrubbed floors unnoticed, every shift she fought back exhaustion, every moment she carried knowledge in silence, and now, in this room of white coats and marble walls, she was no longer invisible. Dr. Blake approached her, her sharp voice, softer now. "You saved him." Monica shook her head. "I just noticed what no one else did." Blake paused, then admitted quietly. "That's what medicine should be." As Caldwell's vitals stabilized further, the room shifted. Doctors no longer looked through Monica. They looked at her. Not a janitor, not background noise, but the woman who saw what 20 specialists missed. She thought of Professor Harrison's old words. The difference between life and death is often who notices first. Tears blurred her eyes. Tonight, she had been that person. Hours later, when the adrenaline faded, the room emptied. Caldwell slept peacefully, his body finally fighting back. Monica stood alone by the window. Snow still fell outside, soft and relentless. Her reflection looked back, tired, uniform wrinkled, hair pulled tight. But something had changed. For the first time in years, she saw not invisibility, but worth. Transition to Chapter 8. News of the miracle spread. Reporters would call it luck, science, even fate. But for Monica Harris, it was something deeper, the moment an invisible woman forced the world to see her. And outside that hospital, the story was only just beginning. The headline hit the morning papers like a thunderclap. Custodian saves tech billionaire. 3 words that flipped the hospital's hierarchy upside down. Reporters swarmed the gates of Massachusetts General. Camera flashes lit the snow. Anchors spoke with urgency. How could 20 doctors miss what a janitor saw? Is this luck, instinct, or genius in disguise? For the first time, Monica Harris's name was spoken aloud, not whispered in dismissal. But inside, Monica sat quietly in the break room. Her phone buzzed with messages she hadn't opened. To her, the noise outside felt surreal. She wasn't chasing fame. She wanted rent money, stability for her kids. Not headlines, not the spotlight. Yet here it was. On TV screens, experts debated. Some praised her intuition. Others dismissed it as coincidence. One panelist said, "We can't seriously elevate custodians to the level of medical specialists." Monica winced. Even when she saved a life, her uniform still spoke louder than her mind. That's the cruel truth in America. Black labor, especially in custodial roles, is designed to be unseen. Hospitals, schools, offices run on their backs. But their voices? Silenced. It's not new. History repeats it over and over. There was the nurse in Chicago, 2016. She noticed a patient's irregular breathing after surgery, flagged it, begged the surgeon to look. Dismissed as over-anxious. Hours later, the man coded. Her instincts saved him, but the attending got the credit. Or the security guard in Orlando, 2019. He tackled a shooter outside a nightclub, disarmed him, saved dozens. The headlines called him unnamed bystander, invisible, even in heroism. Or the bus driver in Atlanta, 2021. He pulled an unconscious passenger from a burning bus. Survivors called him a guardian angel. The city called him lucky, but rarely brave. Monica was now part of that pattern, except her story was too explosive to bury. A billionaire alive, an IPO saved. The system couldn't sweep it aside, so they wrapped her in a narrative. The humble janitor with a stroke of luck. An invisible woman who stumbled onto the truth. Stumbled? No, she fought for it. Every observation, every risk, every memory from classrooms she never got to finish. She thought back to the conference room, the way laughter died, the way silence shifted when evidence spoke louder than credentials. That wasn't luck. That was science. That was persistence. But America has always struggled to accept brilliance when it comes in the wrong uniform. Monica walked through the hospital halls, now noticed. Doctors nodded. Nurses smiled. Even administrators, once blind to her, said, "Good morning." It felt strange, like stepping into light after years underground. But inside, she carried a quieter truth. She hadn't suddenly become capable. She'd always been. Only now, people chose to see it. She whispered to herself, almost a mantra, invisible no more. Sociologists call it the invisibility cloak, placed on service workers, especially black women. They're present everywhere, yet treated as if their minds are absent. Monica had torn a hole in that cloak, but she knew the fabric would try to close again. One evening, she overheard 2 interns whispering. "Do you think she just got lucky?" "Yeah, no way a janitor figured this out on purpose." The words stung, but Monica straightened her shoulders. Luck didn't run chemical tests in a janitor's closet. Luck didn't memorize toxicology lectures from a decade past. That was work. Unseen work. She thought of her kids, of every invisible parent cleaning floors at midnight, every unseen worker keeping the world running. Her story was bigger than one billionaire. It was proof. Brilliance doesn't always wear a white coat. Reporters clamored for interviews. Some wanted sound bites. Some wanted her face on magazine covers. But Monica declined most. She wasn't chasing celebrity. She was holding on to dignity. When asked what she wanted people to remember, she said quietly, "Listen to the ones you don't see. Sometimes they're the ones who save you." The phrase echoed online. Tweets, hashtags. Invisible No More trended for days. For the first time, Monica's story wasn't just hers. It belonged to every worker told they were just something. Just a janitor, just a bus driver, just a nurse. And yet, sometimes those just people hold the line between life and death. As the headlines swirled, Monica stood once again by Caldwell's window. Snow melted under the Boston sun. The city moved on. But her world had shifted forever. She touched her badge, still stamped Custodial Services, a reminder of where she stood and where she might go next. Ethan Caldwell's empire was stabilizing, and with his recovery came an unexpected offer, one that would pull Monica Harris out of the shadows of survival and into a future she never thought possible. Weeks passed. Snow gave way to thaw. Inside Massachusetts General, Ethan Caldwell's strength returned. His empire had nearly slipped into the grave with him. But now he sat upright, thinner but alive. And one afternoon, before a small audience of press, he spoke. "I owe my life not to 20 of the brightest doctors in America, but to Monica Harris, her eyes, her persistence, her courage." He paused, voice steady. "And because brilliance like hers should never be wasted, today I am establishing the Harris Fellowship, a scholarship for those whose education was cut short by circumstance, for the invisible minds who deserve to be seen." Flashbulbs lit the room. Monica stood in the back, overwhelmed. Her name, once ignored, now etched into a foundation. Weeks later, she walked across a different kind of hallway. Not polished marble, but the linoleum floors of a university building. At 40 years old, Monica Harris was a student again. Her heart pounded as she entered the lecture hall. Rows of young faces turned, some curious, some dismissive. Whispers floated. "Is she a professor?" "No, she's in our class." The sting of their eyes cut deep. She felt like an intruder in a world she once belonged to. At night, she studied under dim light, her kids asleep in the next room, bills still piled on the counter, assignments stacked beside them. Some nights she wept quietly, asking herself, "Can I really do this? Or am I too late?" But each morning she rose. Because her children watched, because the fellowship bore her name, because she carried the weight of others like her, those never given a second chance. History echoed. She remembered Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, black women in NASA once labeled computers, dismissed, invisible. Yet they calculated the trajectories that launched America into space. Their story, hidden figures. Her story, hidden until now. She whispered to herself, "If they could break through, so can I." But breaking through was never easy. In labs, some professors underestimated her. "You've been out too long," they said. "Maybe auditing would be better than full enrollment." In group projects, younger students talked over her, as if years of surviving, raising kids, and saving a billionaire's life added up to nothing. The weight pressed hard. Some nights she almost quit. But then she thought of Ethan Caldwell in that hospital bed. She thought of Charles Whitmore's poisoned jar, and she remembered the silence breaking when 20 doctors finally listened. That memory became her fuel. One professor, Dr. Lee, pulled her aside after class. "You see problems differently," he said. "Not from the textbook down, but from the ground up. That's rare." Monica smiled faintly. It was the same gift that once saved a life. Now it was saving her spirit. Still, the struggle remained. She worked part-time to cover living costs beyond the scholarship. She rushed between lectures and shifts, sometimes with no time for meals. Her children noticed. "Mom, you're always tired." She kissed their foreheads and answered, "Tired, but moving forward." Because moving forward meant they, too, would never be invisible. America loves underdog stories, but living them is different. It's not glamorous, it's exhausting. It's carrying doubt like a backpack filled with stones, every step painful, but necessary. As spring settled in, Monica found herself walking campus paths lined with blooming trees. She carried her books close, ignoring whispers. Her steps were heavy, but they were hers. Every footstep echoed like a promise, not just for herself, but for every unseen worker who once dreamed of more. But Monica's journey was far from over, because brilliance can win recognition, yet respect must still be earned every single day. And soon the world would test her again. The auditorium lights dimmed. Rows of physicians, researchers, and students filled the hall. The banner read, "Annual Conference on Emerging Threats in Toxicology." At the podium stood Monica Harris, not in a grey custodial uniform, but in a tailored blazer, a badge pinned to her chest. Toxicology specialist. She took a breath, the same breath she once held in a janitor's closet, mixing vinegar and foil. Her voice rang steady. Sometimes what saves a life isn't the grand discovery. It's the detail everyone else overlooks. On the screen behind her, slides appeared. Not flashy, just simple images. Yellowed fingernails, strands of brittle hair, a jar of cream. She pointed gently. These clues told a story missed by 20 specialists. But the pattern was there, always there, hidden in plain sight. Heads nodded across the hall. Pens scribbled, screens lit with notes. Monica continued. Science isn't about who speaks the loudest, it's about listening, to evidence, to patterns, and sometimes to voices the system ignores. Her mind drifted back, uninvited, to that night in the suite, the laughter, the sting of Maya's dismissal, the silence when her proof spoke louder than credentials. That memory had become her anchor. She clicked to the next slide. A quote filled the screen. "The difference between life and death is often who notices first." Professor Harrison. She looked out over the crowd. "I was never supposed to be here. Not at this podium. Not in this role. I was supposed to mop floors and stay invisible. But the truth is, brilliance doesn't vanish just because life interrupts it. And silence doesn't mean ignorance." The room held its breath. Then she added softly, "How many others are out there? Nurses dismissed, orderlies ignored, parents working 2 jobs who could have been researchers. How much knowledge have we lost because we never thought to listen?" She shifted, telling stories that weren't hers but echoed the same pattern. The nurse in Chicago, silenced when she spotted complications. The bus driver in Atlanta, saving passengers from a fire but remembered only as lucky. The janitor in New Jersey, who alerted authorities to a gas leak before anyone else noticed, preventing an explosion that could have leveled a block. They weren't specialists, they weren't credentialed, but they noticed, and that made all the difference. Monica's hands rested firmly on the podium. Her voice grew stronger. Credentialism has its place. Training matters. Degrees matter. But wisdom, observation, courage, those don't belong to institutions. They belong to people, all people. The hall was silent. Not the silence of dismissal this time, but the silence of realization. She concluded with one last slide. Ethan Caldwell's signature on the Harris Fellowship. Today, dozens of students are back in classrooms because someone believed they deserved another chance. They're not invisible anymore, neither should you be. Applause erupted, not polite, but thunderous, sustained. Monica stood tall, not triumphant, just grounded, because this was never about glory, it was about truth. Afterward, young students approached. "Dr. Harris," they said, though her title was still new. "You inspire me." She smiled, humbled, remembering nights she doubted if she'd even survive classes at 40. Now she was the voice she once needed to hear. As she left the stage, she paused by the exit. The auditorium behind her buzzed with conversation, but she stood still, breathing in the weight of the moment. Her journey had begun in shadows. Now she carried light. But Monica's story isn't just hers. It's a mirror, a reminder that the smallest detail can save a life, and the quietest voice can change the system. The question is, will we listen? The lights dim, the applause fades, and Monica Harris steps out into the night. Boston streets hum with ordinary life, traffic lights, footsteps on wet pavement, laughter spilling from corner cafes. For her, every sound feels sharper, every moment heavier. She thinks back to where it all began. A janitor's cart, a jar of poisoned cream, a whisper no one believed, and now a fellowship bearing her name, a stage where her voice carries a life saved. But beneath the triumph lies a deeper truth. Cruelty, ignoring someone, dismissing them, making them invisible, is the world's most expensive luxury. It cost Ethan Caldwell his health. It nearly cost him his life. It cost society brilliance hidden in plain sight. It costs voices that could have changed the course of history. How many Monica Harrises walk past us every day, unseen? How many answers slip away because pride refuses to listen? There's an old saying, the graveyard is full of unwritten books, unsung songs, and unheard ideas. Not because people lacked genius, but because the world refused to hear them. Monica's story is proof. When cruelty silences, lives are lost. But when kindness listens, miracles happen. She isn't a billionaire, she isn't a household name, but her story reminds us, real power isn't money. It isn't credentials. It isn't the suite with walnut walls and chandeliers. Real power is the choice to see others, to respect them, to give them the dignity they deserve, because the most extravagant luxury isn't gold or diamonds, it's compassion, and cruelty, no matter how polished, is the costliest indulgence of all. So tonight, as Monica walks home beneath Boston's street lamps, the message lingers. Listen to the invisible. Notice the details. Because sometimes the smallest act of respect is the rope that pulls someone back from the edge. And to you, watching, listening, this story is more than a tale of one woman. It's a challenge. When you see injustice, will you stay silent, or will you speak? When you cross paths with someone overlooked, will you look away, or will you choose to see them? You've been with us through this journey of shadows and light. If Monica's story moved you, share it. Let it remind someone that their voice matters. And if you believe more hidden voices deserve to be heard, stay with us here at Black Voice Matter. Like, subscribe, comment your thoughts. Because the conversation doesn't end here. And remember, cruelty is the world's most expensive luxury. But kindness is free.